Can you hear me? Good? Can you hear me? Am I going to start spitting and sputtering like the other night? You can hear me now? So we're starting part 5 tonight. I've got 2 more to do after tonight, and then it'll be done. So we're going to start tonight on the Day of the Lions. But before I do that, I'm going to pray. Well, you can't hear it? Can you hear it now? Okay. Yeah, my voice is kind of low, so it takes a little extra power to get it out. Yeah. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for your word. And we wait upon your word, Lord. The word Jesus. We know he's coming soon because we see the signs, Father. And they multiply every day. Every day I see them out there, Lord. So we praise you and we worship you. And we thank you for giving us the sight to see these things as they happen. In the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen. My eyes have a tendency to leak. Still working? Okay. It's better now? I moved it down a little bit, so maybe it was up too high. So like it moved, see? All right, let me move this down here. Get it out of my way. The Day of the Lions. The lion is a symbol of power, authority, and royalty. The Battle of Jerusalem began on June 5th, when the Jordanian army, despite Israel's warning to refrain from war, began shelling Israel's positions around the ancient city. Now remember, we're in 1967 now, the Six-Day War. In order to cut off Jordanian forces and to stop the shelling, Israel set out to encircle the mountains and roads that surrounded the ancient city. Central in the encirclement of Jerusalem was Israel's Harel Brigade. The brigade's commander was ordered to seize the vital passageways leading to and from the city, and to take the mountain ridges to the north and east of Jerusalem. The success of the Harel Brigade would give Israel control of the Judean hills and open the door for the Jubilean event. The Lions would be the 55th Brigade, a brigade of paratroopers. On the eve of the Six-Day War, the 55th Brigade was being prepared for battle in the Sinai Peninsula. But the war's rapidly shifting dynamics caused a change of plans. The brigade was instead sent to fight in the hills surrounding Jerusalem. On the morning of June 7th, the brigade commander was standing with his men on the Mount of Olives. His intelligence officer received word from the Army's chief of staff to take Jerusalem. Remember the birds from a few chapters ago? Remember the birds, the taking of Jerusalem by the British in 1917. The first time in history that a war over the land of Israel and Jerusalem involved the sky and wings. What scripture was appointed in the Book of Common Prayers to be read on the last day of fighting in the Battle of Jerusalem? The prophecy that spoke of the Lord delivering Jerusalem as birds flying, Isaiah 31:5. Isaiah was there when Jerusalem was under siege by the Assyrians. It was then that he prophesied that the Lord would deliver Jerusalem and that the deliverance would come as birds flying. There was more to the prophecy. In verse 4, it speaks of another animal. Isaiah 31 and 4. Let me go to that one. Isaiah 31 and 4. It says, "For thus the Lord spoken unto me, like as the lion and the young lion roaring on his prey when a multitude of shepherds is called forth against him. He will not be afraid of their voice, nor abase himself for the noise of them. So shall the Lord of hosts come down to fight for Mount Zion and for the hill thereof." So the prophecy foretells the deliverance of Jerusalem as birds flying and as lions roaring. The deliverance of Jerusalem in the Jubilee of 1917 came as birds flying. Could it be that its deliverance in the Jubilee of 1967 would come as lions roaring? In the days leading up to the war, many feared for the young nation's survival. But once the war began, Israel was aroused as a lion. The nation responded to its encroaching enemies with massive force, ferocity, and lightning-like speed. And as the roar of a lion strikes fear in the hearts of its enemies and melts their resolve, so the roar of Israel's might in the Six-Day War struck fear in the hearts of those who planned its destruction and melted their resolve. As a lion's roar warns its enemies not to invade its territory, so Israel warned Jordan not to invade its territory. It was the defiance of that warning that would usher in the fulfillment of prophecy. The lion is also a symbol of Israel's royalty. Jerusalem was the throne from which the kings of Israel reigned. The city itself became identified with the lion and would be adorned with their images. So in the Six-Day War, Israel battled for its royal city, the city of lions. There's more to the mystery. The commander of the Harel Brigade was Colonel Ben Ari, A-R-I. Ari means lion. The Lord would fight as a lion. In the Six-Day War, leading the troops in the battle for Jerusalem was a man named Lion. The prophecy says that the Lord will fight as a lion specifically for Mount Zion and for its hills. That Jerusalem, the city set on the mountain of God, that's Jerusalem, the city set on the mountain of God. Harel means Har, mountain. Har means mountain. And El means God. So the mountain of God. So the brigade was called the mountain of God, and the commander of the brigade was called the lion. His name meant lion. But that's not the end of it. So in the battle for Jerusalem, Colonel Ari and the Harel Brigade, the lion and the mountain of God. So the Lord fought as a lion for Mount Zion. Another leader, another colonel, who played a central role in the regaining of Jerusalem, he was the operations officer of the Central Command. He was the one who directed the battle from Jerusalem. On the morning of June 7th, he gave the critical command to the 55th Brigade to take Jerusalem. His name was Arik, A-R-I-K, Regev. Arik means lion. So the battle for Jerusalem was directed by a man named Lion. Wait, there was another. The man who received the command to take the city, the intelligence officer of the paratroopers brigade, he was the one who came up with the plan that put the paratroopers in place to enter the city gates. His name was Arik, A-R-I-K, Akamon. And his name was also Lion. So now we have 4 lions. So the man who gave the command to take Jerusalem and the man who received it were both named Lion. And the one who devised the plan that led to the return of Mount Zion was named Lion. And then there was the man who, more than any other soldier in the Six-Day War, became famous for his role in the city's liberation. He was also a colonel. He was the commander of the 55th Paratroopers Brigade, the one who led them into the gate and the one who took the Temple Mount and then the Western Wall. His name was Mata Gur, G-U-R. His name comes from a different Hebrew root. Gur means lion cub or young lion. So the man who actually took the city and who led the nation through its gates was also named Lion. Gur and Akmon were the first two to enter the gates. Do you remember how the prophecy began? As the lion and the young lion, Isaiah 31:4. The prophecy specifically identifies two lions in the deliverance of Jerusalem, the lion and the young lion. The prophecy speaks of a lion roaring over its prey. In this case, the Lord roaring as a lion. So it was Gur, the young lion on the Temple Mount, who roared to Israel and to the world the most famous words of the war. The Temple Mount is in our hands. The day after Jerusalem's liberation, the nation's founder, the first leader, David Ben-Gurion, walked through the gates of the ancient city. He was at that time an old man. In Hebrew, Gurion means lion cub. So now we're up to 6. Do you know which gate it was that the soldiers entered through to win Jerusalem? Anybody know? The Lion's Gate. No one could have put all this together. No one but one. The prophecy says it will be as the lion, but it will be the Lord. The manifestation of the lions in Jerusalem's restoration wasn't about lions. It was about the sign from ancient times that behind it all was the hand of God bringing to pass the prophesied return and restoration. The Almighty moving as a lion. The Jubilean man. What was the central sign of the Jubilee? People returning to their land. What was the sign that the Jubilee had come? What was it that heralded it? So it was written in Leviticus 25:9 in the Jubilean ordinance. Then you shall cause the trumpet of Jubilee to sound. The trumpet of Jubilee is the ram's horn, the shofar. For the Jubilee to begin, the shofar had to be sounded. It was the sounding of the shofar that signaled the return of the year of return and restoration, and release throughout the land. Is it possible that in 1967, the sign of the Jubilee, the sounding of the shofar, could have manifested? The central moment of that Jubilee came as Israeli soldiers entered the ancient city and made their way to the most holy of places. The images of Israeli soldiers returning to the Temple Mount and to the ancient stones of the Western Wall reverberated across the world. It was the defining moment of the war and the embodiment of the Jubilean return. It was at that precise moment that an ancient mystery manifested. In the midst of the soldiers standing at the Western Wall was a man holding a ram's horn. He set it to his mouth and blew. The sound ordained in ancient times to proclaim the return of the exiled heirs to their lost inheritance, now proclaimed to the world the return of the Jewish people to their lost inheritance. And who was the man? Rabbi Shlomo Goren. Remember him? The same one who sent for the priest and the Nazir. He can tell you about the Nazir. Goren wasn't born in the land, but was one of the exiles who returned from the nation. He was born in Poland. When he was a boy, his family immigrated to Palestine, which was at that time under British rule. In the Orthodox Jewish world, he was recognized as a prodigy. At the age of 17, he was ordained as a rabbi. Beginning with Israel's War of Independence, he served in the army as a military chaplain. It was Goren's conviction that the return of the Jewish people to the land was central to God's purposes of world redemption. Yeah, because it's prophecy. It has to happen. Yeah. So it would be part of the world redemption. And they're the last part of it, the Jewish people. In the first days of the Six-Day War, Goren was at the front lines of battle. At his side was a shofar. In the midst of battle, his vehicle was struck by enemy fire, and the shofar was destroyed. Goren then asked his father-in-law if he could borrow his shofar for what could be the liberation of Jerusalem. His father-in-law complied. In the days leading up to the Six-Day War, Goren had prophetically spoken of the city's liberation. On the morning of June 7, 1967, he would be there with the first Israeli troops as they approached the city. As he entered with the soldiers through the Lion's Gate, he set the shofar to his mouth and sounded it. It was the very moment of the Jubilean return. He continued sounding it as he and the troops made their way to the Temple Mount, another prophetic return. The return of the Jewish soldier to the sacred ground lost in the war against Rome in 70 AD. Another Jubilean moment, 2,000 years in the making. Each shall return to his own possession. Goren made his way to the western wall for the sounding of the shofar that would reverberate around the world. In ancient times, who was it that sounded the shofar of Jubilee? Though the ordinance doesn't specify, it was the priests who were called to mark the holy days of Israel, to sound the trumpets and to herald the appointed times of God, the moed, the moedim, the appointed days. All the feasts are moed, moedim. The im on the end of moed is just plural, means it's plural, more than one. And the priests were the ministers of the Jubilee. Rabbi Goren wasn't born of the priestly house, but through marriage had become part of it. His father-in-law, David HaKohen, was born of the priestly line. In the ancient times, it was the shofar belonging to the priest that marked and ushered in the nation's sacred times and holy days. Goren's father-in-law was a priest, so the shofar that was sounded in Jerusalem at the moment of Israel's return to her holy city was the priestly shofar. So God puts everything in order. The guy that was going to blow the other shofar he had wasn't a priest. He's just a rabbi. But his father-in-law, who he got the horn from when his was destroyed, was a priest. So the priest's shofar was blown. It's amazing. It's amazing. So as it was in ancient times, so it was on June 7, 1967. The shofar of the priests sounded in Jerusalem to usher in the sacred times of God. Rabbi Goren would sound the shofar in early June at the time of the wheat harvest. The wheat harvest is Pentecost. Okay? I just thought that was free. I just threw that one in. In the year of Jubilee, in the year of Jubilee, in returning to its first owner, the land returns to its original state. Do you know what the original state of the temple was? A threshing floor. When the Temple Mount was first purchased by King David, it was a threshing floor. Do you know what the Hebrew word for threshing floor is? Goren. In Hebrew, threshing floor is Goren. Rabbi threshing floor. So the man who returns to the threshing floor is named threshing floor. The guy that blew the shofar, his name means threshing floor in Hebrew. In the Jubilee, the original state of the land is reaffirmed. So Goren's very name manifested the original state of the land and reaffirmed its ancestral connection to the Jewish people. Goren was born in 1917, the year of Jubilee. He was born in the year of the Balfour Declaration, the liberation of Jerusalem from the Ottoman Empire, the year of return and restoration. Each Jubilee is joined to the next. So Goren was born in one Jubilee to usher in the other. He himself was 50 years old. the Jubilee of his own life. It wasn't only the shofar that was a sign, but it was the man himself. He was the embodiment. He was the Jubilean man. The Masada algorithm. The mystery would now be one of timing. The mystery concerns the timing between two events, the fall of Jerusalem and the fall of Masada. They took place in the same decade. The return to Masada and the return to Jerusalem would also take place in the same decade. The return to Masada and the return to Jerusalem happened in the 1960s. When exactly did Masada fall? The fall of Masada was determined to have taken place in 74 AD. From 70 AD to 74 AD is 4 years. If we apply the mystery, could it reveal the timing between the Jewish people to Masada and their return to Jerusalem? Israel returned to Masada in 1963. Add 4 years, you get 1967, the year of Israel's return to Jerusalem. Let's go deeper. When exactly was it that Jerusalem was lost and the exile began? The temple was set on fire on the 10th day of Av. It would have been a Sunday on the Western calendar. The Hebrew date places it 49 days before the Feast of Trumpets. The Feast of Trumpets takes place on the new moon that begins the Hebrew month of Tishri. In the year 70 AD, the new moon of Tishri took place on September 24th on the Julian calendar. Subtract 49 days, we get August 6th, the first day of the exile. According to the ancient accounts, the defenders of Masada died on Passover, the 15th day of Nisan. On the Western calendar, it would be March 31st, 74 AD. We take the exact number of days between the two ancient dates and apply the mystery of reversal, a time span of 1,333 days. So to reverse, find the day Israel returned to Masada and count 1,333 days forward. It was the day Yigal Yadin, Israel's archaeologist general, inaugurated the excavation of the desert fortress on the morning of October 31st, 1963. So October 31st, 1963, plus 1,333 days brings us to what? Come on, who can do it real quick? June 7th, 1967, the exact date of Israel's return to Jerusalem. So the Six-Day War had to happen when it did. The Arab world had to threaten Israel exactly when it did. And the waiting period had to go for the exact number of days it went on. And the Soviet Union had to send Egypt the false report on the exact day they sent it. There's no way that could be, man. There ain't no way. Not only that superpower, but the other one as well. It was America that restrained Israel from acting until finally given the go-ahead just days before the war. And the soldiers had to enter the Lion's Gate on the exact day. They had to return to Jerusalem on the 1,333rd day. And nobody planned it, at least nobody on earth. It all took place in a time of social upheaval, a war in Southeast Asia, a countercultural revolution, a race to the moon, and a summer of love. It was in the middle of all these things the ancient mystery was moving, as it was the year of Jubilee. And it all came about through the intrigues of an atheistic superpower, the fury of the Arab world, the mobilization of armies, a song that touched a sacred longing, and a war that shook the world and brought an ancient people back to their lost possession. The ancient mystery was working, bringing every event together to coalesce into the appointed purposes to the exact day. The year of Birah. As each Jubilee sets in motion the events of the next era, so did the Jubilee of 1967. The Six-Day War altered the dynamics of the Middle East. The failure of Arab nationalism in that war opened the door for the ascent of radical Islam. It ushered in an era of terrorism, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Osama bin Laden, and 9/11. It gave birth to a new U.S.-Israeli alliance and caused the U.S. to become the chief arbiter in the Middle East. As for the Soviet Union, the defeat of its Arab allies in the Six-Day War caused alarm among its European allies and satellite nations and the weakening of the communist bloc. The Jubilee of 1967 transformed not just the nation of Israel and the Middle East, but ultimately the world. Some observers even commented that ever since 1967, the world had been living in the seventh day of the Six-Day War. In other words, continual fighting since then. And I think there was a rabbi from Nazareth that told us that was going to happen. There would be no peace. As for Israel, it was now overseeing a land mass several times larger than what it had possessed before the Six-Day War. As for Jerusalem, the city prospered and grew. The Jewish quarter was rebuilt and inhabited, and the words of Jeremiah were fulfilled. Jeremiah 8:4-5. Old men and old women shall again sit in the streets of Jerusalem. The streets of the city shall be full of boys and girls playing in the streets. The years after 1967 saw more Jewish people coming back to the land than ever before. At the same time, it was in this period more than any other that Jerusalem became the focal point of global controversy. Israel would declare Jerusalem as its capital, and Jerusalem would become the only national capital the world refused to recognize. The Hebrew word bira means capital. The next Jubilee would fall in 2017. What would we expect to see in the Jubilee of 2017? What was it that was not given or restored in the Jubilee of 1967? The Jubilee of Capitol Hill. In the year of Jubilee, the return of the heirs to their ancestral inheritance must be given legal authority and recognition. But in this case, the original owner is not a person, but a nation. The nation of Israel itself. Therefore, the legal recognition of its return must come from the nations, from the world rulers and authorities. In the return of the exiles from Babylon, that legal authority was given by the greatest world power of that age, the Persian Empire, and its king, Cyrus. In the Jubilee of 1917, the legal authority came from the greatest power at that time, the British Empire. And in the return of Israel into the world, it came from the greatest of the post-war powers, America. But in the return of Israel to Jerusalem in 1967, the world refused to recognize that return of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. In the Jubilee, if the original owner returns to his possession and the authorities refuse to recognize that return, then the return will not be complete and there will be conflict. And we've had conflict ever since. And it continues today. Not only did the world refuse to recognize the return, but the nations gathered together over and over again to condemn that return and to declare it illegal. The United Nations, it was there that they issued condemnation after condemnation against Israel. More condemnations than they had ever issued against all the nations of the world combined. And many of those were focused on what happened in the Jubilee of 1967. The world was condemning the return. The world was condemning the Jubilee and warring against the Jubilean restoration. Israel is the only nation whose title deed to its land and capital was the Word of God itself. In all its history, Jerusalem had been the capital of only one nation, Israel. And yet the world declared that it had no ancestral right or connection to its ancient capital. But one of the manifestations of the Jubilee is that the heirs return to the land is given legal authority and recognition. 2017 was the 50th year after the return of Jerusalem in the Six-Day War, the Jubilean year. The world's preeminent power was the United States of America. The highest legal legislative body of the world's eminent power was the United States Senate. In the mid-1990s, the United States Congress passed a law calling for America's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. But the president at that time signed a waiver delaying its implementation. The waiver was renewed every 6 months by every successive president. But in 2017, America had a new president, Donald Trump. And it was the year of Jubilee. The waiver expired in late spring. The new president had promised a change in policy concerning Jerusalem, but then, as did the other presidents before him, he signed the waiver. Still, it was the Jubilee. The waiver just happened to be set to expire in June, the month that marked 50 years from the last Jubilean event. In fact, it was set to expire during the 50th year anniversary week of that event. The U.S. Senate gathered together, and the mystery manifested. The Statue of Freedom is the figure that crowns the Capitol building. It was in that building that the Jubilean event of 2017 would be set in motion. A resolution was introduced that concerning Jerusalem and the granting of legal recognition to what had taken place one Jubilee earlier, the return of Jerusalem. The Senate resolution was a Jubilean document. The Jubilee focuses on the return of the ancestral possession to its owners, and that was the exact focus of the Senate resolution. In the year of Jubilee, the original owner's sovereignty to the land is affirmed, reaffirmed, and given legal recognition, which is exactly what the Senate resolution called for. The Jubilee joins together two things: the 50-year period with the return of the ancestral possession. So the Senate resolution joined together the 50-year period with the return of the ancestral possession of Jerusalem. Leviticus 25:10, and you shall consecrate the 50th year. In the year of Jubilee, the 50th year is consecrated. So in the year of Jubilee, the U.S. Senate consecrated the 50th year. The resolution said this: whereas June 2017 marks the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War and the reunification of the city of Jerusalem, whereas in 1967 Jerusalem was reunited by Israel during the conflict known as the Six-Day War, whereas this year marks the 50th anniversary that Jerusalem has been administered as a united city. These are all the things they said about the 50-year thing. After the consecration of the 50th year comes the restoration. After the Senate set apart the 50th year, it called for the recognition of the restoration. This is what they said: resolved that the Senate recognizes the 50th anniversary of the reunification of Jerusalem, reaffirms the Jerusalem Embassy Act as United States law, that was the one they passed in the 90s, and calls upon the President and all United States officials to abide by its provisions. In the year of Jubilee, every authority in the land, from king to priest to judge and magistrate, was to recognize the restoration of the land to its original owner. So the Senate resolution called for the President and every American official to recognize the restoration of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, to grant legal recognition to Israel's sovereignty over its holy city that had been missing for the past 50 years. The Senate resolution was a proclamation of Jubilee. It followed the pattern of what was decreed in the Jubilean ordinance. After that, its requirements must be implemented. So the resolution began by first proclaiming the Jubilee over and over again, and then after that, it called for its implementation. It is all the more striking that the highest legislative body of the greatest world power would produce a resolution that was in effect a proclamation of the Jubilee. Not only in the Jubilean year, but in the Jubilean month and the Jubilean week. In fact, the Senate passed its Jubilean resolution on the day of the Jubilee. 50 years from the start of the Six-Day War to the exact day. The Jubilean resolution went forth on the day of Jubilee. They knew it was 50 years, but they had no idea that they were fulfilling the mystery and that which was ordained in the law of Jubilee. The days. The three Jubilees. The Statue of Freedom represented the Jubilee of 2017. The man with the eye patch, Moshe Dayan, everybody remembers him, right? He always had that eye patch on. Anybody that's our age, anyway. I remember him. Stood for the Jubilee of 1967, and General Allenby, the Jubilee of 1917. The Senate resolution wasn't the central event of that Jubilean year, but the opening event. It would set the course that would lead to the central Jubilean event. What was the central Jubilean event of 1967? Anybody remember? The regaining of Jerusalem. The property coming back to the original owner. Yeah, that's what the Jubilee is all about. What was the opening event that set everything in motion? The war's opening. The start of the Six-Day War. Israel's surprise attack on the airfields of its enemies. That opening strike would lead to the return of Jerusalem, the central event of that Jubilee. It was June 5th. The opening day of the Jubilee was June 5th. What was the opening event of the Jubilee of 2017? The Senate resolution on June 5th, the same day. The Jubilee of 1917, what was the Jubilee event of that year? The Balfour Declaration. The British giving Israel the authority to go back to their land. And Allenby's liberation of Jerusalem from the Ottoman Empire. The Balfour Declaration was approved at the end of October 1917, the same time the war to liberate Jerusalem began. Allenby's army would enter Jerusalem in the early days of December. In his memoirs of the war, Lloyd George revealed the details behind Allenby's appointment. The other guy that was in charge was failing, so they took him out. The war cabinet came to the conclusion that it was more desirable to introduce leadership into the command of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force on 5 June 1917. The war cabinet decided that General Allenby should be appointed as commander-in-chief of the British forces in Egypt. So on the exact same days, on June 5th, in three different Jubilees, these things happened. It all happened on June 5th. The appointment would set in motion the chain of events that would bring about the liberation of Jerusalem and the Jewish homeland promised in the Balfour Declaration. So the event that opened the Jubilee of 1917 was June 5th. The event that opened the Jubilee of 1967 was June 5th, exactly 50 years later. And the event that opened the Jubilee of 2017 was June 5th, exactly 50 years after the event that opened the Six-Day War, and exactly 100 years after the day that opened the Jubilee of 1917. All three Jubilees were set in motion on the exact same day. Each opening event would lead to Jerusalem. I wonder why that is. I think there's a certain name up there on the... Yeah. What began on June 5th, 1917 would lead to Jerusalem's liberation from the Ottoman Empire. What began on June 5th, 1967 would lead to the return of Jerusalem to the Jewish people. And what began on June 5th, 2017 would lead to the Jubilean Declaration. Remember what I told you about the granting of legal recognition and authority. In the Jubilee, it's not just that you return to your land, but that the return has legal authority. It has to be recognized by the ruling authorities. In Israel's return to Jerusalem in 1967, it was the one thing that was never given. But in 2017 was the first Jubilee after the return to Jerusalem. One of the manifestations of the Jubilee is the granting of recognition and legal authority to the owner's return to the land. But Trump signed the waiver. He signed it in June. The waiver lasted 6 months. December would be the very end of the Jubilean year. It would have to manifest then. On December 6, 2017, the president entered the White House diplomatic reception room with an announcement to give to the world. He said, "I have determined that it is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Through all of these years, presidents representing the United States have declined to officially recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. In fact, we have declined to acknowledge any Israeli capital at all. But today, we finally acknowledge the obvious, that Jerusalem is Israel's capital." That's a bold statement from Trump. And that's probably why God put him in there, because he knew he was the guy bold enough to make that statement to the world. The 50th year had come, and again, like clockwork, the mystery of the Jubilee had manifested. It was the restoration that had been missing in the Jubilee of 1967, the legal recognition of the return. The event was momentous. It was the first time an American president had recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, the first time in modern history that any world leader or nation had ever recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, or even as belonging to Israel. It was the first time any major power had recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel since ancient times. The Prime Minister of Israel responded to the Jerusalem Declaration by calling it one of the 4 milestones in the history of Israel's restoration. The others, the Balfour Declaration, the 1948 founding of the Jewish state, and the liberation of Jerusalem, each one linked to the mystery. The declaration sent the world into an uproar. There were condemnations, demonstrations, threats, violence. When the trumpet was blown, they went into an uproar. The spiritual forces by which nations are driven. You see, the war over Jerusalem is ultimately a spiritual one. The world's raging over Jerusalem went back to the days of Israel's rebirth. In 1949, after surviving the attack of 5 armies intended to annihilate it, Israel managed to gain possession of West Jerusalem. The nations gathered at the UN to pass a resolution attacking Israel's right to West Jerusalem and calling for immediate action to forcibly drive Israel out. It was the first time that the world would specifically attack Israel's sovereignty over its ancient capital, and the first time it would call for action to separate Jerusalem from the Jewish nation. The resolution would seal the world's course for years to come. It was passed on December 9th, 1949. It's a noteworthy date. December 9 was the anniversary of the Jubilean event of 1917, the day Jerusalem was liberated from the Ottoman Empire. Did they plan to do it on the same day? No. The war over Jerusalem is a spiritual one, and one that transcends anyone's planning. On the world's calendar, the resolution was passed on December 9th. But on the biblical calendar, it happened on a different day, the 18th day of Kislev. Why is that significant? President Trump issued the Jerusalem Declaration recognizing Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem and Jerusalem as Israel's capital on the 18th day of Kislev, the exact same day. So on the anniversary of the day the world issued its declaration that Jerusalem was not the capital of Israel, the president issued the Jerusalem Declaration proclaiming that Jerusalem was the capital of Israel. But that wasn't the only mystery to manifest in the Jubilee of 2017. The Senate resolution went forth in June at the 50-year mark. The Jubilee anniversary week of Jerusalem's liberation in the Six-Day War, the President's declaration went forth in December at the 100-year mark. the double Jubilee anniversary week of Jerusalem's liberation by General Allenby. 4 days before Trump issued the declaration, the appointed scripture was that which spoke of the return of Jacob, the return of Israel to his ancestral possession. Genesis 32. I'll go to that one. (32:4). Well, I'm not going to read it all because it actually goes all the way into 36. I'll just read some of it. All right, I'll just read the first start of it here. And he commanded them, saying, Thus shall ye speak unto my lord Esau, thy servant Jacob saith thus, I have sojourned with Lebanon and stayed there until now. So this is when Jacob is coming back to Israel after staying with Laban for all the years. And it goes all the way through chapter 36, verse 43, if you want to read it all. I'm not going to read it here. It'd take too long. But that's what it is. And basically, he's just talking about, in Genesis, Jacob's return to his ancestral possession, back to Israel, or Canaan at that time. So I'll just keep going on with the rest of it then. And it wasn't the only appointed scripture. From the scroll of the prophets, the appointed words spoke of how the Jewish people had been removed from their holy city, how it was taken by the peoples of the region to whom it did not belong. It declared that Jerusalem was the possession of the Jewish people and how they would again return to that mountain, to Jerusalem. For the first time in 2,500 years, a proclamation had gone forth sanctioning the return of the Jewish people to Jerusalem, the return of each to his own possession. And that's what I've got. Next time it'll be part 6 with the return of the Persian.